Ethan had always lived his life guided by the simple belief that small, thoughtful actions could change the course of a day. As a young man working long hours at a local auto repair shop, he had learned the value of hard work and patience, two things that had shaped his character. The days were long, the work was physically exhausting, but he always kept his eyes on the bigger picture. Every evening, when the day's work was done, he looked forward to a peaceful dinner at home with his sister Sarah. Tonight was no different, but there was something about Sarah's birthday dinner that made it even more special. She had been planning it for weeks, eagerly choosing the menu, decorations, and inviting friends and family to celebrate. Ethan, as usual, had been caught up in the rush of his daily grind and hadn't had time to think much about anything beyond the shop. His routine was predictable. Wake up early, spend the day under the hood of a car, and return home for a brief moment of rest before heading back to the grind the next day. He was used to the monotonous cycle, but it didn't bother him much. He took pride in the work he did, and at the end of the day, he was content. But tonight was different. As the clock neared 6 p.m., Ethan could feel the anticipation building in his chest. His sister's birthday dinner was one of the few times they got to come together as a family, to enjoy good food, laughter, and each other's company. He knew she had put a lot of effort into making it memorable, and he didn't want to disappoint her. It had been a tough year for both of them after their parents' passing. They relied on each other more than ever, and tonight was supposed to be a celebration of that bond. After finishing up his last repair for the day, Ethan grabbed his jacket and headed toward the subway, ready to catch the train that would take him to Sarah's house. It was already rush hour, and the train was crowded, with passengers crammed into every corner, some standing, others sitting. Ethan managed to squeeze his way into the car and grabbed a spot by the door, glancing around at the other commuters. That's when he noticed her. A woman, pregnant and clearly struggling to maintain her balance as the train rocked back and forth. She was standing, gripping the overhead rail tightly, but her face showed signs of discomfort. Ethan's heart tightened as he watched her sway slightly, her hand moving to her lower back, clearly in pain. The train's movement made it harder for her to keep her footing, and the crowded car seemed to make no room for her. People stood nearby, oblivious, absorbed in their phones, the noise of the train masking her quiet struggle. Ethan's eyes lingered on her for a moment, and then something inside him stirred. He couldn't stand seeing someone in need, especially when no one else seemed to notice. Without thinking twice, he stepped forward, his voice breaking through the noise of the train. "You can take my seat," he offered, his tone genuine and calm. The woman looked up at him, surprised at first. Her eyes seemed tired, and her lips parted as if she was about to say something, but then stopped. After a brief pause, she nodded gratefully. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but filled with relief. Ethan stepped aside as she lowered herself onto the seat, taking a deep breath and closing her eyes for a moment. He could see the relief on her face as she settled into the seat, her hands resting on her rounded belly. It was a small act, but it made Ethan feel good, knowing he had done something to make her day just a little bit easier. He stood by the door, watching her for a moment before turning his attention back to the passing scenery outside the window. The noise of the train faded into the background, and for a moment, everything felt right. He glanced at his phone. 6:30 p.m., the exact time Sarah had set for the dinner to begin. He would be there soon, and the thought of seeing his sister's smiling face, surrounded by friends and family, lifted his spirits. Ethan thought about the things he valued most: his family, his sense of responsibility, the satisfaction of a job well done, and more than anything, kindness. In a world that often felt chaotic, he believed in the quiet power of simple gestures. He had seen how just a few words or a small action could brighten someone's day. And that belief had always been the guiding force in his life, even in the smallest moments. As the train continued its journey, Ethan's mind drifted to Sarah's birthday dinner again. It was a rare opportunity for them to relax, to be together without the weight of their everyday worries. There was something comforting in those moments, those pieces of life that reminded him why he worked so hard. But little did Ethan know that the simple act of offering his seat to the pregnant woman would soon set off a chain of events that would change everything. What began as an innocent and kind gesture would soon be turned upside down, and Ethan would find himself at the center of a misunderstanding that would shake his trust in the world around him. The evening that should have been a peaceful celebration would soon spiral into chaos, and the kindness that had come so naturally to him would be called into question in ways he never imagined. The train rumbled on, its wheels screeching against the tracks as it made its way toward the next station. Ethan, still standing by the door, felt a sense of calm wash over him. The rhythmic movement of the train, the soft hum of the conversations around him, and the gentle sway of the car all seemed to blend together in a comforting lull. It was a brief respite from the chaos of the day, a few moments of peace before he would return to the noise and excitement of Sarah's birthday dinner. But the stillness was shattered in an instant. The pregnant woman, who had been sitting across from him, suddenly let out a gasp. Her hand flew to her chest, her face contorting in pain. The air around her seemed to grow heavy, and before anyone could react, she collapsed forward, crumpling onto the floor of the subway car. A collective gasp spread through the crowd, followed by the sound of frantic movement. People scrambled to get out of the way, some shouting for help, while others fumbled for their phones to dial emergency services. Ethan's heart raced, his instincts kicking in as he rushed toward her. He crouched beside her, his hands hovering over her, unsure of what to do. She was still breathing, but her breaths were shallow and labored. Her face was pale, her eyes unfocused, and she trembled slightly. "Hey, are you okay?" Ethan asked gently, his voice strained with concern. He looked around, hoping someone would take charge, but it felt like the whole car had descended into chaos. A few passengers were shouting at the conductor, asking for help, while others seemed frozen, unsure of how to assist. Ethan's hand hovered near the woman's shoulder, unsure of what kind of help she needed. He could feel the weight of the situation, the panic creeping in. He knew it was just a subway ride, just another ordinary evening, but suddenly everything felt so much more urgent. "Somebody call 911," a voice shouted from across the car. Ethan turned his head, trying to locate the source of the voice, but there was too much movement, too much noise. In that moment, he felt a strange sense of helplessness, even as he knelt beside the woman, doing what little he could to offer comfort. The woman's breathing became more erratic, and Ethan's concern grew. He reached out, gently placing a hand on her arm. "Stay with me," he muttered, though he knew she couldn't hear him. The panic in the air was palpable, and his mind raced through possible scenarios. Was she in labor? Was she having a medical emergency? His thoughts were interrupted by a shrill voice. "She's fainted," someone called. "Is she all right? What happened to her?" The woman groaned, her eyes fluttering open briefly before she slipped back into unconsciousness. It was hard to know what was going on in her mind, but Ethan knew one thing for sure. She needed help, and she needed it fast. The train screeched to a halt at the next station, but it felt like time had stopped. The doors opened, and more people rushed in, oblivious to the commotion at first. But the sight of the woman lying on the floor, surrounded by concerned passengers, quickly drew their attention. One woman, an older passenger in a red jacket, rushed forward, her face contorted with worry. "Someone needs to do something," the woman said, her voice sharp, clearly upset. "This is ridiculous." Ethan's mind was still reeling from the suddenness of it all. Just moments ago, he had been standing by the door, his only concern being that he might be late to his sister's birthday dinner. Now, he was on the floor of a subway train, unsure if this woman would be okay. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, his chest tightening with anxiety. "Is anyone calling an ambulance?" he asked, his voice sounding too calm in contrast to the rising panic around him. "I did," someone replied from the crowd. "But what if she's in labor? Shouldn't we help her?" Ethan didn't know what to say. He wasn't a doctor, and he had no experience in situations like this. But he knew one thing. This woman was in need of immediate help. He glanced around the car, looking for someone who could take charge. But no one seemed to know what to do, and the uncertainty in the air only fueled the panic. He was so focused on the woman that he didn't notice the passengers around him starting to whisper. It started as a murmur, barely noticeable at first, but as more people crowded around, the whispers grew louder. A few exchanged glances, and others began to eye him with suspicion. Ethan felt it. The subtle shift in the atmosphere, the tension that began to bubble under the surface. The woman groaned again, her eyes fluttering open for a moment, before closing once more. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, but he kept his focus on her, praying for help to arrive soon. "Isn't it strange?" one of the passengers said quietly. "He was so close to her." Ethan froze, his heart skipping a beat. He hadn't even thought about it in that moment, but the comment echoed in his mind. He had only offered her his seat. He had only tried to help. But as the murmurs grew louder, the shift in the atmosphere became impossible to ignore. Doubts began to settle into the minds of the passengers, and Ethan's act of kindness, something so simple and so innocent, now seemed to be turning against him. The whispers carried with them an unspoken question, a suspicion that started to take root in the hearts of the people around him. Ethan couldn't help but feel the sudden weight of their gaze. What had started as a good deed was quickly becoming something far more complicated. And little did he know, it was just the beginning of a much darker turn of events. The chaos inside the subway car was escalating, and the atmosphere seemed to grow tenser with each passing second. Ethan's mind was racing, trying to focus on the woman lying unconscious before him. But the murmurs from the other passengers were growing louder, seeping into his thoughts like a creeping fog. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. What had begun as a simple act of kindness was now morphing into something else entirely. The woman had regained consciousness for a brief moment, her eyes fluttering open, but her gaze seemed unfocused. She gasped for breath, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Ethan's hand instinctively moved to her arm, trying to offer comfort, but before he could speak, her voice came out, weak and strained. He did something to me." The words were barely a whisper, and she seemed to have no strength left in her, but they were enough to send a chill through Ethan's spine. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, and Ethan's blood ran cold. He could hardly process what she had just said. What did she mean? What was she accusing him of? He had only offered her his seat, nothing more. The entire situation had unfolded so quickly he hadn't even realized how this could have been misinterpreted. "Did what?" one of the passengers demanded, his voice rising in shock. "What are you talking about?" The woman's breathing became more erratic as she tried to focus on Ethan, her hand weakly pointing in his direction. I don't know what he touched me." The words hit Ethan like a slap in the face, and in that moment, everything seemed to freeze. His hands trembled as he looked around at the now suspicious faces of the other passengers. The air felt thick with doubt. "I didn't," Ethan began, his voice shaking. But before he could finish his sentence, the atmosphere in the car shifted. Whispers began to fly. Some passengers stared at him with wide eyes, while others whispered between themselves, eyes darting to him and then back to the woman. "He touched her?" Someone repeated in disbelief. "I saw them too close together," another passenger added, his tone laced with accusation. Ethan's mind was spinning. His heart was pounding in his chest. He couldn't make sense of what was happening. He had done nothing wrong. He had simply offered his seat to a woman in need, just like anyone would. But now, his kindness seemed to have turned against him. The accusations were out there, and they were taking root quickly, like wildfire in dry grass. "I only offered her my seat," Ethan said, his voice rising, trying to defend himself against the mounting tension. "I didn't touch her. I didn't do anything wrong." But his words seemed to have little impact. The whispers didn't stop. In fact, they only grew louder. The woman's accusation hung in the air like a dark cloud, and the passengers' gazes remained fixed on Ethan with suspicion, some of them even taking a step back, as if afraid of what he might do next. He could feel the shift in the air, the cold, judgmental stares, the doubt in their eyes. It was as if the very act of helping someone had become a crime. "Call the police!" someone shouted from the back of the car. Before Ethan could respond, two officers who had been riding in the subway car stepped forward, their badges gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. They looked at Ethan and then at the woman, assessing the situation in a matter of seconds. One of them, a middle-aged man with a stern face, approached Ethan. "Step off the train, sir," he commanded, his tone firm but not unkind. Ethan's chest tightened, his throat going dry. He had never been in trouble with the law before. This was a nightmare, a surreal moment that he couldn't escape. He wanted to explain, to tell them that it was all a misunderstanding, but the fear in the eyes of the other passengers told him everything he needed to know. They had already made up their minds about him. "I'm not going anywhere until you understand," Ethan said, desperation creeping into his voice. "I didn't do anything to her." But the officer didn't seem to hear him. Instead, he motioned to another officer, who pulled out a phone and started making a call to the authorities. Ethan's hands clenched into fists, his mind racing for answers. How had this happened? How had something so innocent spiraled out of control so quickly? The officer's stern gazes made it clear that they were taking the accusations seriously. And in that moment, Ethan realized the power of suspicion. No matter how he tried to explain himself, the truth seemed irrelevant in the face of the woman's words. He had become the villain in his own story, and there was nothing he could do to change it. As the train doors slid open at the next station, the officers motioned for Ethan to exit the train. Reluctantly, he complied, his mind in a haze. He stepped off the train into the cold, harsh light of the station, his thoughts swirling with confusion and disbelief. He had never felt so isolated, so misunderstood in his life. The pregnant woman's weak accusations continued to echo in his mind, even as the officers led him to a quiet corner of the platform for questioning. The crowd on the train had settled, but their eyes still followed him as he was escorted away, their judgment heavy on his shoulders. The situation was unraveling in ways Ethan couldn't have imagined, and all he wanted was to clear his name. But the damage had already been done. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it was spreading faster than he could keep up with. As the officers began their questioning, Ethan couldn't shake the sinking feeling in his stomach. How could something so simple, so good, have turned into something so horrible? He had only tried to help, and now he was being treated like a criminal. The weight of the false accusation felt unbearable, but he had no choice but to face it head on, hoping that somewhere, somehow, the truth would come to light. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the officers led him to a corner of the platform, away from the rest of the passengers. The train had continued on its way, but the weight of the entire situation hung over him like a thick fog. His mind was spinning, but all he could focus on was the growing crowd of onlookers, their eyes following his every move. He could feel their judgment, their doubt pressing in on him from all sides. The officers, a man and a woman, stood silently as Ethan was asked to remain calm. They had already called for backup, but the noise of the subway station seemed to amplify every second that passed. Ethan tried to keep his breathing steady, but it was impossible to ignore the tension building around him. The woman officer glanced at her partner, then back at Ethan. "You were the only one near her when she collapsed, correct?" she asked, her voice cold, almost clinical. Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "Yes, but I didn't do anything wrong. I just offered her my seat. That's all." The man officer, his face unreadable, folded his arms across his chest. "Did she say anything to you before she collapsed?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "No," Ethan replied quickly. "She didn't say anything. She just collapsed. I didn't touch her. I don't even know what's happening here." His voice broke at the end, and he could feel the tears threatening to well up in his eyes, but he fought them back. This wasn't the time to break down. The woman officer stared at him, and Ethan could sense the doubt in her gaze. "Then why did she accuse you of doing something to her?" she asked. Her tone was calm, but there was an edge to it, as though she wasn't entirely convinced. "I don't know," Ethan said, his voice hoarse. "Maybe she was confused. She was fainting. She wasn't thinking straight." The officers exchanged a look, then turned to Ethan again. The woman officer spoke first. "We have to take her statement seriously. We'll need you to wait here for a while as we investigate." Ethan's stomach twisted. "Wait here? What do you mean? I didn't do anything wrong. I just want to go home." The man officer raised a hand, signaling for him to stay calm. "We understand, sir, but for now, we need to question you further. We can't let you leave until we get more information." Ethan's frustration began to bubble over. "More information? What more is there to say? I didn't do anything." But his outburst only seemed to make things worse. The woman officer's expression hardened, and Ethan could feel the distance growing between him and the officers. They were treating him like a suspect, not someone who was trying to help. Behind him, the murmurs of the crowd seemed to grow louder, even though he couldn't see them. The passengers who had witnessed the scene were no longer just watching. They were talking, exchanging opinions. He could hear snippets of their conversations, some still questioning what had happened, others outright accusing him of wrongdoing. Their voices were filled with suspicion, and Ethan couldn't escape the feeling that they had already decided he was guilty. "She said he touched her," one voice whispered. "I saw him standing too close," another added. The words hit Ethan like daggers, each one deepening the wound of the false accusation. He had never felt so alone, so trapped. All he had done was offer a seat, a simple act of kindness, and now he was the center of a growing storm of suspicion. As the minutes ticked by, Ethan began to feel as though the walls were closing in. He tried to maintain his composure, but the pressure was unbearable. He could feel his chest tightening, his breath becoming shallow. His hands were clammy, his heart racing. The woman officer glanced at her partner, then back at Ethan. "You'll need to stay here while we sort this out. The paramedics are with her now, and we'll be getting a full statement from her soon." Ethan didn't say anything. What could he say? He was being treated like a criminal, and there was nothing he could do to convince them otherwise. He tried to hold it together, but the sense of powerlessness was overwhelming. He couldn't understand how this was happening. How had his simple, compassionate gesture turned into this nightmare? The sound of footsteps approaching interrupted his thoughts, and he turned to see two more officers walking toward him, their expressions stern. One of them was holding a tablet, likely to review the security footage from the train. The man officer nodded at them. "We'll need to review the footage, see if we can find anything that could explain her accusation." Ethan's stomach churned at the thought. The security footage might show what had happened, but would it show the truth? Or would it only add more fuel to the fire of suspicion? He had no way of knowing, but he clung to the hope that the cameras had captured the reality of the situation, that they would see he had done nothing wrong. The officers motioned for Ethan to sit on a nearby bench, and he complied without a word. As he sat there, his eyes glued to the ground, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was trapped in a nightmare. All he had wanted was to make sure the woman was okay, to do the right thing. But now, the simple act of kindness had turned into something unrecognizable, something he couldn't escape. The minutes dragged on, each one stretching into what felt like hours. Ethan could feel his mind unraveling, the weight of the accusation pressing down on him more with each passing second. The tension in the air was suffocating, and as the officers discussed the next steps, Ethan couldn't help but wonder how his life would change after this moment. How could he ever go back to being the man he was before? Kind, helpful, innocent, when all anyone would remember was the false accusation that had stained him forever. His thoughts were interrupted as the man officer approached him again, holding the tablet. "We've reviewed the footage," he said, his tone unreadable. "We'll be getting a full statement from you shortly. Stay here, please." Ethan barely heard the officer's words. All he could focus on was the pounding of his own heart, the sense of helplessness consuming him, and through it all, he clung to one simple hope: that somehow, someway, the truth would come to light. Ethan sat on the bench, his head buried in his hands as the voices around him blurred into a cacophony of noise. He couldn't think, couldn't process what had gone so horribly wrong. The officers were still talking among themselves, reviewing the footage on the tablet, but their faces gave away nothing. Ethan's hope wavered as he glanced at the growing crowd. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed someone stepping forward, a teenager, maybe 16 or 17, moved through the crowd with a determined look on her face. She wore a hoodie and carried a well-worn backpack slung over one shoulder. Her phone was in her hand, and her expression was a mix of apprehension and resolve. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice steady despite the murmurs around her. The officers turned to face her, surprised by the sudden interruption. "I have something you need to see." The girl walked straight up to the officers, holding out her phone. "I recorded what happened on the train, from the moment the woman got on until she collapsed. You can see everything." Ethan's head shot up at her words. His heart leapt with a fragile mix of hope and disbelief. Could this girl really have captured the truth? The officers exchanged a glance before one of them, the woman officer, gestured for the girl to hand over her phone. "Let me see," the officer said, her tone more cautious now. The teenager unlocked her phone and brought up the video, which she had already cued to the right moment. She handed it over, her hand trembling slightly. "It's all there," she added. The officers watched the video in silence, their expressions shifting subtly as the footage played. Ethan strained to read their faces, desperate for any sign that his nightmare might finally be ending. The teenager stood nearby, biting her lip nervously, as if unsure whether she had done the right thing. The video captured everything. Ethan offering his seat to the pregnant woman, standing up to let her sit, and keeping a polite distance as the train swayed. It showed the moment she collapsed, with Ethan crouching down to check on her, his movements careful and concerned. There was no sign of any inappropriate behavior, no evidence of the accusations that had been thrown his way. "It's clear," the woman officer said at last, her voice quieter than before. She turned to her partner, who nodded in agreement. They both looked at Ethan, their expressions softening ever so slightly. "This supports your story." Ethan exhaled sharply, relief washing over him like a wave. But even as the truth began to emerge, the crowd remained uncertain. Some passengers muttered among themselves, while others craned their necks to get a glimpse of the video. The teenager turned to Ethan, her voice cutting through the noise. "I saw everything. You didn't do anything wrong. You were just trying to help." For the first time that evening, Ethan managed a faint smile. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Thank you for speaking up." The officers handed the phone back to the teenager, their demeanor less accusatory now. "We appreciate your cooperation," the woman officer said to the girl. "This helps clarify the situation." But even as the officers acknowledged the video, they remained cautious. "We still need to finalize our report," the male officer said, addressing Ethan directly. "The paramedics are speaking with the woman now. Once we confirm her condition and statement, we can close this matter." Ethan nodded, though the lingering tension in the air reminded him that the ordeal was far from over. The truth was on his side now, but the weight of the accusation still hung heavily over him. The teenager lingered for a moment longer before stepping back into the crowd. Her presence had been a beacon of hope in a dark moment, but the uncertainty in her eyes mirrored Ethan's own feelings. Would the truth be enough to clear his name, or would the doubts of the passengers and the scars of this experience follow him forever? As the officers returned to their tasks, Ethan sat back on the bench, his mind racing. The tide was turning, but the fight wasn't over. He had the truth on his side now, but the question remained, would it be enough? The tense air of the platform was suddenly broken by the arrival of paramedics wheeling the pregnant woman on a stretcher toward a waiting ambulance. Ethan's heart pounded as he watched, desperate for some clarity. He knew her condition held the key to unraveling the nightmare he was trapped in. The woman's face was pale but calmer now. An oxygen mask covered her nose and mouth, and her eyes fluttered open as the paramedics prepared to lift her into the ambulance. A medic crouched beside her, speaking softly, though his words were too faint for Ethan to hear. One of the officers approached the paramedics, her notepad in hand. "What's her condition?" she asked, her voice low but firm. The lead paramedic glanced up. "She experienced a sudden drop in blood pressure," he explained. "Classic symptoms: dizziness, fainting, shortness of breath, likely caused by dehydration or prolonged standing in her condition. It's unrelated to anything external." Ethan's chest swelled with relief, but it was quickly tempered by anger. All of this, the accusations, the humiliation, had stemmed from something entirely out of his control. Yet the lingering weight of the false accusation still bore down on him, refusing to let him feel truly free. The officer nodded, jotting down notes. "Has she said anything since regaining consciousness?" The paramedic hesitated. "Not much. She's disoriented, but she did mention feeling confused before she collapsed. She didn't seem to understand what was happening." Ethan stepped closer, his voice breaking through the officer's conversation. "So she doesn't even remember accusing me?" he asked, his frustration evident. The officer glanced at him, her expression softening slightly. It's possible she spoke out of confusion or fear, she admitted. But we can't ignore what was said in the moment. Even when it's not true? Ethan shot back, his voice rising. You've seen the video. You know I didn't do anything to her. Yet I'm the one being treated like a criminal. The officer opened her mouth to respond, but the male officer intervened. Sir, we understand your frustration, he said, his tone measured. But it's our job to follow protocol. You're not under arrest, and we've already clarified the facts of the case. Please remain patient while we conclude the report. Ethan clenched his fists, biting back another retort. His entire body felt taut with the strain of holding himself together. Even with the truth emerging, it felt like the stain of suspicion would never fully wash away. The murmurs among the onlookers began to shift, the revelation about the woman's condition filtering through the crowd. Some people expressed relief that she was receiving care, while others whispered about the misunderstanding that had led to Ethan's questioning. She wasn't feeling well, a man muttered. Guess it wasn't his fault after all. Still, you'd think he'd act a little less defensive, another person added, their tone skeptical. Ethan turned toward the crowd, his jaw tightening. No matter what he did, some people would always see him as guilty. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but he refused to let their opinions define him. The teenager who had defended him earlier stepped forward again, her phone still in hand. Why are people still whispering like that? She asked, her voice sharp. The video proves he didn't do anything, and the medics said she fainted because of her blood pressure. What more do they need? Her words silenced some of the murmurs, and Ethan felt a flicker of gratitude. She was a stranger, yet she had done more to defend him than anyone else. The female officer approached Ethan once more, her expression less formal now. Mr. Carter, you're free to go, she said. We've reviewed the footage and spoken to the medics. It's clear you weren't at fault. Ethan's shoulders sagged with relief, but the victory felt hollow. Free to go, he echoed bitterly. After being accused in front of everyone here, after being treated like I did something awful, do you think that just disappears because you say it's clear now? The officer hesitated, guilt flashing across her face. I understand how you feel, she said quietly, but we had to ensure everyone's safety. I hope you can understand that. Ethan shook his head, unable to muster a response. He glanced at the teenager, who gave him an encouraging nod, and then at the paramedics loading the pregnant woman into the ambulance. She didn't look at him, and a part of him wondered if she even remembered what had happened. The officers began dispersing the crowd, urging everyone to move along. Ethan stood there for a moment, watching the platform empty, before he finally turned toward the stairs leading out of the subway station. As he climbed the steps, the weight of the ordeal pressed on him like an anchor. The truth had come out, but it didn't feel like a victory. The judgment, the whispers, the lingering looks, they were scars he would carry long after this day was over. And yet, as he reached the street above, he realized something important. The teenager's defense, the paramedic's diagnosis, the video evidence, these were reminders that the truth could prevail even in the darkest moments. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't fair, but it was something. Ethan inhaled deeply, letting the cold night air fill his lungs. He was free, but the battle wasn't over. The fight to reclaim his dignity and prove his character would continue, and he would face it head-on, one step at a time. Ethan stood on the sidewalk just outside the subway station, the events below ground replaying in his mind like a broken record. The relief of being cleared by the officers was overshadowed by the whispers and lingering stares from the crowd. He wasn't sure what hurt more, the accusation itself, or the way people had so readily believed it. The teenager, who had silently followed him out of the station, stepped up beside him. Her name, he learned earlier, was Mia. You shouldn't let them get to you, she said, glancing back at the dispersing crowd. People love drama more than the truth. Ethan managed a weak smile. Easier said than done, he replied. But thanks for stepping in back there. Without your video, I don't even want to think about what would have happened. Mia shrugged, but there was a flicker of pride in her eyes. I just did what anyone should have done. It's messed up how quick people are to assume the worst. The two of them stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the city filling the void. Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out to see a missed call from his sister. His stomach churned. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, a night to honor her birthday. Instead, he had spent hours defending himself against something he didn't do. "You should go," Mia said, noticing his hesitation. "You've got people waiting for you, right?" Ethan nodded, but didn't move. "Yeah, but it's not that simple." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "How do I walk into a party after all this? How do I pretend like I'm okay?" Mia frowned. "Maybe you don't have to pretend. Just tell them what happened. If they care about you, they'll understand." Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but a commotion further down the sidewalk caught their attention. A small group of people had gathered around a man in a red coat who was gesturing animatedly. Ethan recognized him as one of the passengers from the train, the one who had been the most vocal in questioning his innocence. "I'm just saying," the man was telling the group, his voice loud enough to carry. It was suspicious how close he was to her. "Maybe the cops let him go, but you can't trust everything you see in a video." Ethan felt his anger spike. He had hoped that the incident would end with the officer's clearance, but it seemed that the shadows of doubt were harder to shake than he'd imagined. Mia noticed his clenched fists and stepped in front of him. "Hey, don't. It's not worth it." "But he's lying," Ethan said through gritted teeth. "He's spreading more rumors after everything I've already been through." Mia met his gaze, her expression firm. "I know, but confronting him here will only make things worse. Let him talk. People like that always reveal their own ignorance eventually." Ethan hesitated, his emotions warring within him. Every fiber of his being wanted to march over and set the man straight, but Mia's words rang true. Engaging would only add fuel to the fire, giving the crowd more reason to gossip. "Fine," he said at last, his voice taut with restraint. "But I'm not going to stand here and listen to it." Mia smiled faintly. "Good call. Come on, I'll walk with you for a bit." They started down the street, leaving the murmurs and stares behind. With each step, Ethan felt a fraction of the tension ease. Mia's presence was a quiet reassurance, a reminder that not everyone was quick to judge. As they walked, Mia pulled out her phone. "You know, I was thinking," she began, tapping away at the screen. "I could upload the video, let people see what really happened." Ethan stopped in his tracks. "What?" "No, that'll just bring more attention to it." "Exactly," Mia said, turning to face him. "Attention on the truth. The more people see what actually happened, the harder it'll be for anyone to twist the story." Ethan considered her words, his mind racing. He hated the idea of the incident becoming even more public, but Mia had a point. The video had been his saving grace on the platform. Maybe it could protect him from the lingering doubts as well. "All right," he said after a long pause. "Do it. But don't include my name or face if you can help it. I don't want this following me forever." Mia nodded, her fingers flying across her phone. "Done. Trust me, this will help." As they continued walking, Ethan felt a strange mix of hope and apprehension. The truth was out there now, and he could only hope it would be enough to drown out the voices of doubt. Still, the shadows of the evening clung to him, and he knew the road to reclaiming his peace was far from over. But with allies like Mia and the truth on his side, he felt a spark of determination reignite within him. He would face whatever came next, step by step, until the weight of the day finally lifted. The evening stretched on, and Ethan found himself in a haze of emotions as he walked toward his sister's apartment. Mia had left after ensuring her video upload was live, promising to keep him updated if there was any response. Ethan appreciated her efforts, but still carried the heavy burden of doubt and humiliation. As he reached the building, the familiar buzz of his sister's intercom brought a fleeting sense of comfort. His sister, Clara, answered almost immediately. "Ethan, you're late," she said, her voice a mix of annoyance and concern. "Come up, everyone's been waiting." Ethan sighed, but managed to force a cheerful response. "I'm on my way up." He stepped into the elevator, trying to push the night's events to the back of his mind. But as the elevator ascended, so did his anxiety. He wasn't ready to face the questions, the smiles, and the inevitable worry that would come from Clara. The moment he stepped into the apartment, the warmth of family surrounded him. Clara greeted him at the door, her bright eyes narrowing as she took in his tired expression. "Ethan, what happened? You look—" "Don't worry about it," he cut her off, plastering on a smile. "Happy birthday, Clara." He pulled a small gift from his jacket pocket and handed it to her. It was a modest present, an elegant bracelet he'd saved up for. But her face lit up as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "Thank you," she said softly, her initial concern easing as she pulled him into a hug. "I'm glad you're here. Come on, everyone's in the living room." Ethan followed her, doing his best to push through the evening. His family and a few close friends were gathered, chatting and laughing. He joined in where he could, though his mind kept drifting back to the subway, to the accusatory stares and whispered judgments. As the party wound down, Clara cornered him in the kitchen. "All right, spill it," she said, crossing her arms. "I know something's wrong. You've been distracted all night." Ethan hesitated, then let out a heavy sigh. "Something happened on the way here," he admitted. He recounted the events of the subway, the pregnant woman's collapse, the false accusation, and the crowd's suspicions. Clara's expression shifted from shock to outrage as he spoke. "They accused you of what?" she exclaimed. "And no one stood up for you?" "One person did," Ethan said, thinking of Mia. "A teenager. She filmed everything and showed the officers. That's the only reason I was cleared." Clara shook her head, her hands gripping the counter. "I can't believe people can be so quick to judge, and you just let it go?" "What choice did I have?" Ethan replied, his voice tinged with frustration. "I wasn't going to fight a crowd. The truth came out, but it doesn't feel like it matters. People still think what they want to think." Clara's expression softened. "I'm sorry, Ethan. You didn't deserve that." "Thanks," he said quietly, "but it's over now. I just need to move on." Before Clara could respond, Ethan's phone buzzed. He pulled it out to see a notification from Mia. The video she uploaded had gone viral, with thousands of views and comments pouring in. Curious, he opened the link and scrolled through the responses. To his surprise, many of the comments were supportive. "This guy deserves an apology. The video proves he did nothing wrong." Imagine being accused of something just for helping someone. Unreal. "Glad someone filmed this. People need to stop jumping to conclusions." A few, however, were less forgiving. "Looks suspicious to me. Why was he so close to her?" You can't blame people for being cautious. Better safe than sorry. Ethan's chest tightened, the mix of support and skepticism echoing his own internal conflict. Clara peered over his shoulder, her brows furrowing as she read the comments. "Well, at least people are seeing the truth," she said. "That's something." "Yeah," Ethan murmured, though he wasn't sure if it was enough. The damage had been done, and no viral video could erase the memory of the humiliation he felt on that platform. Clara placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing, Ethan. And you're not alone in this. People will see the truth, even if it takes time." Ethan nodded, her words offering a small comfort. He set his phone down and took a deep breath. The night's events had shaken him, but he couldn't let them define him. The truth was out there now, and with time, he hoped it would be enough to clear his name, for good. The next morning, Ethan woke up to a flood of notifications on his phone. As sunlight streamed through his window, the buzzing device seemed to mirror the chaos of the day before. Reluctantly, he reached for it, bracing himself for whatever awaited him. Mia's video had gained even more traction overnight. It had been shared by several social media accounts, including one belonging to a popular influencer known for advocating fairness and justice. The caption read, "False accusations can ruin lives. Watch how this man's act of kindness turned into a nightmare, and how the truth prevailed." The comment section was alive with debates. "It's a good thing this was recorded. Imagine if there was no proof. This is why we need to stop jumping to conclusions without evidence. The poor guy. He deserves an apology from everyone on that train." Ethan scrolled through, his emotions swinging between gratitude and frustration. While many were standing up for him, a vocal minority still clung to their doubts, questioning his intentions despite the clear evidence in the video. As he made his way to the auto repair shop for work, the city felt different. The usual hum of the streets seemed to buzz with unseen eyes. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, his mind replaying the faces from the train, faces that had judged him without hesitation. When he arrived at the shop, his coworker Liam greeted him with a wide grin. "Morning, superstar," he teased, holding up his phone. "You're all over the internet? What happened, man? Some kind of subway drama?" Ethan sighed, setting his bag down. "Long story, I'd rather not get into it." But Liam wasn't deterred. Come on, Ethan. This video's everywhere. People are talking about how you got accused for no reason. That's messed up, but hey, at least the truth came out. Ethan forced a small smile, but his unease lingered. The attention felt overwhelming, even if it was mostly supportive. Yeah, I guess. Just hoping it blows over soon. The day passed slowly, each task at the shop giving Ethan some respite from his thoughts. But during his lunch break, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from an unknown number. Hesitant, he answered. Hello, is this Ethan Parker? A warm, professional voice asked. Yeah. Who's this? This is Jessica Monroe, a reporter with the City Chronicle. I've been following the story about what happened to you on the subway. First, let me say, I'm sorry you had to go through that. I'd like to interview you, if you're open to it. I think it's important for people to hear your side of the story directly. Ethan's stomach twisted. The last thing he wanted was more attention, but the reporter's tone was earnest. He hesitated. I'm not sure. I've already been through enough. I don't know if I want to talk about it anymore. I completely understand, Jessica said gently. But stories like yours highlight the importance of fairness and understanding. You were brave to stand your ground, and sharing your experience could help others see the harm in rushing to judgment. Ethan considered her words. He didn't want to relive the ordeal, but maybe speaking out could turn his experience into something meaningful. All right, he said finally, but just one interview. That's it. Of course, Jessica replied. Thank you, Ethan. I'll work around your schedule. Let me know when you're free. After the call ended, Ethan felt a mix of apprehension and determination. He had spent so much energy defending himself against assumptions and rumors, but perhaps this was a chance to reclaim the narrative on his own terms. That evening, as he sat in his small apartment, he opened his phone again. Mia had messaged him, sharing links to posts and messages from people who had seen the video and expressed their support. You've got people rooting for you, Ethan, she wrote. Don't let the negativity get you down. Ethan smiled, her words a small but meaningful balm for the wounds the experience had left. For the first time since the subway incident, he felt a flicker of hope. The truth was gaining traction, and while the road ahead wouldn't be easy, Ethan knew he wasn't alone in facing it. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet resolve. He had survived the worst of it, and he was ready to move forward, step by step. The day of the interview arrived, and Ethan found himself nervously adjusting his collar as he sat across from Jessica Monroe in a small, bright studio. The reporter was friendly, her reassuring demeanor helping to ease his nerves. The cameras were discreet, but the weight of their gaze was still heavy. Thank you for agreeing to do this, Ethan, Jessica began. Your story has sparked a lot of conversation, and I believe many people can learn from your experience. Let's start from the beginning. Can you tell us what happened that night on the subway? Ethan recounted the events, his voice steady despite the memories stirring within him. He described offering his seat to the pregnant woman, her sudden collapse, and the chaos that followed. He spoke candidly about the false accusation, the crowd's quick judgment, and the teenager, Mia, who had stepped up to defend him. As he spoke, Jessica nodded, her expression sympathetic, but intent. It must have been overwhelming, she said. How did you feel in that moment when people began to assume the worst? Ethan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. It was devastating. I felt powerless. I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, but it didn't seem to matter. People believed what they wanted to believe, and I couldn't change their minds. But the truth did come out, Jessica said, her tone hopeful. Mia's video cleared your name, and now it's reaching thousands of people. How do you feel about that? Ethan considered her question. I'm grateful for Mia and everyone who stood up for me. But even with the truth out there, it doesn't erase what happened. That moment of doubt, of being judged unfairly, it stays with you. It's made me realize how quick we are to jump to conclusions without knowing the full story. Jessica leaned forward slightly. What would you like people to take away from your story? Ethan met her gaze, his voice steady. I want people to think twice before making assumptions. We all make snap judgments, but those judgments can have real consequences. Kindness and understanding are simple things, but they can make a big difference. I hope my experience encourages people to give others the benefit of the doubt. The interview wrapped up soon after, and as Jessica thanked him, Ethan felt a sense of catharsis. Speaking out had been difficult, but it also felt like a step toward healing. Later that evening, Ethan joined his sister Clara for dinner at her apartment. The table was set with his favorite dishes, and Clara had even lit candles to create a warm, calming atmosphere. As they ate, Clara brought up the interview. I watched it live. You were amazing, Ethan. Honest, thoughtful. You really got your message across. Ethan smiled faintly. Thanks, Clara. I just hope it makes a difference. It will, Clara said firmly. People need to hear stories like yours. It's a reminder that the world isn't black and white, and everyone deserves a chance to be heard. As they finished their meal, Ethan found himself reflecting on the past few days. The ordeal had been painful, but it had also taught him valuable lessons about resilience, the importance of truth, and the strength found in kindness. The next morning, Ethan woke to find a message from Mia. Your interview was amazing. People are really responding to it. Keep your head up, Ethan. You've inspired a lot of us. Ethan felt a surge of gratitude. While the experience had been harrowing, it had also shown him the power of connection and the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity. As he left for work, he passed a young man helping an elderly woman cross the street. The sight brought a small smile to Ethan's face. The world wasn't perfect, but moments of kindness, no matter how small, could ripple outward, making a difference. And with that thought, he resolved to keep moving forward, carrying the lessons of the subway incident with him. He wouldn't let fear or judgment stop him from being kind. Instead, he would use his story to remind others of the impact their actions and assumptions could have, one moment at a time. In the end, Ethan's journey was not just about clearing his name, but about confronting the deeper truths of human nature, the quickness to judge, the power of kindness, and the resilience needed to rise above adversity. What had begun as a simple act of generosity on a crowded subway became a life-altering lesson in understanding, patience, and courage. Through it all, Ethan remained steadfast, refusing to let the darkness of false accusations overshadow the light of his character. As he moved forward, Ethan carried with him the hope that his story would inspire others to pause, to reflect, and to choose kindness over judgment. Because in a world where assumptions can easily spiral into harm, compassion and understanding are the bridges that bring us closer together. Thank you for taking the time to listen to Ethan's story. We hope it touched your heart and made you think about the power of kindness, understanding, and standing up for what's right. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with others. Together, we can spread a message of compassion and remind the world that small acts of kindness can create big changes. Stay tuned for more inspiring stories, and thank you for being part of this journey with us.